Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our little talk today on the history of the John Roan School. I'm Kath Smith, I'm the head teacher of the school, and today I am really pleased to be welcoming Barbara Reid, an ex-student of the school from 1960 to 67, who has been doing a little bit of finding out about the history of this great school and is going to be sharing her insights with us this evening. Not only was Barbara a student at the school, but she was also a parent of the school a little bit later in the 90s, and I'm sure that her experience as a parent as well as that of a student would have really fired her up when we were looking into the history of the school. So Barbara's really kindly offered to talk to us a little bit tonight. And because we're live, it's a little bit more complicated, but if people have got questions that they want to ask Barbara at the end, what I'm going to suggest you do is use the chat, please. I will be looking at the chat as the evening goes on, and when Barbara's finished talking, what she will then do is listen to me as I pull together questions, and then Barbara, I'm going to ask you to be answering some of those questions as well. So hopefully we'll be able to cover a full range of questions. If you just post them in the chat, I'll be monitoring that, and then I will ask Barbara the questions at the end of the evening. So without much further ado, what I'd like to do is now pass over to Barbara, who will be talking to us for the next half an hour or so and showing us some of her slides.
Thank you, Kath, and good evening, everybody. I think many of us, during the recent long days of being stuck inside, were looking at how we could connect with our local community when we couldn't meet up. I run a local history group. It's in the Ashburnham Triangle, which is close to the centre of Greenwich, and the triangle is bounded by Greenwich High Road, Greenwich South Street and Blackheath Road. I wanted to organise some talks on Zoom for the history group, but I had trouble finding speakers, so I decided to put together a talk myself on the history of one of the buildings that's within the triangle in Devonshire Drive, and that building was the old Roan Girls' School, and that was where I was a pupil from 1960 to 1967. My interest goes beyond myself being a pupil. As Kath said, my own sons were students at the school in the 90s, and I had an uncle who was at the Roan Boys' School in the 1930s. So 3 generations of my family have been involved with the school. I live just around the corner from the old Roan Girls' School, which was sold by the Roan Foundation in 1987 and turned into luxury flats. So, who was John Roan? The founding of the school dates back to the 17th century. John Roan, the founder, was born around 1600. His family owned land in Greenwich, and they were servants in the royal household. During his life, John Roan became a sergeant of the scullery to King James I. This was at the Palace of Placenta, right in the centre of Greenwich on the riverside. And you can see from this slide buildings I'm sure you'll recognise. I took this photograph from the other side of the river, but this is now Greenwich University, and at one time it was the old Royal Seamen's Hospital, and that was built on the site of the Tudor Palace of Placentia. So that was where the palace was situated, where John Roan was working. Being sergeant of the scullery was quite an important role. He would have been in charge of the kitchen, which would have been in a separate building, a series of rooms housing various foods, plate, utensils and serving dishes. His job would have been to oversee all the kitchen staff, as well as the buildings and their contents. we can assume that he was reasonably well paid. In 1640, he was appointed to yeoman of His Majesty's Harriers under King Charles I. That was an important role with the King's Hunt. When John Roan died in 1644, he was buried in St Alfred's Church in the centre of Greenwich. He had amassed quite a large estate. His only child had died in infancy, so he left his funds to his wife Elizabeth, and then to the daughters of his friend Richard Wakeham, and finally to the founding of a school for the poor town-bred children of Greenwich. This he specified to be children aged between 7 and 15. The school was to furnish the children with clothing, a distinctive grey coat and hat, and to teach them skills in reading, writing and ciphering. The will named the vicar and the church wardens of St Alphege as the school's trustees. The school began as the Greycoat School, or Roan's Charity School, and it was opened for the education of boys in 1677. John Roan stipulated that every child should wear his badge. The first school is thought to have been a one-room building. It lay in the centre of Greenwich between Romney Road and Turnpin Lane. And it was within the grounds of the helpless ward of the Royal Seamen's Hospital. It opened with 18 pupils. By 1753, the number of boys had reached 33, and further increases are documented throughout the remainder of the 18th century. During this time, the revenues of the Roan estate grew dramatically. Donations were made and included a generous sum from William Hooker, the Mayor of London. By 1814, the estate could afford to clothe, feed, educate 100 boys. The Greycoat School remained at Romney Road until the early 1800s, when the trustees of the hospital sought to acquire the school building as part of the estate and part of the improvements. The hospital paid for a new school to be built at Roan Street, and this is the building that you can see on your screen now. It still exists today. I took that photo last month, and it's had very, very few changes, very minor alterations to it. It was completed in 1809. And if we can have the next photograph, you can see just along from the building is the tablet that was on the school, the Greycoat School, founded by Mr. John Roan, 1677. It was around this time that the trustees proposed that the Roan estate should make a contribution towards the education of girls in Greenwich. A decree was issued that £130 of the Roan estate's revenue was to be paid towards the maintenance of a school. And in January 1815, the Greenwich National School of Industry and Excellence was opened and became the forerunner of the school that I went to in Devonshire Drive. The building still exists. If we could see the next, that's the one. You might know this as St Alfred's Church Hall. It's at the back of the church. It's a low one-storey yellow brick building, and it provided for 150 girls aged between 11 and 12. It's interesting to note that at the time, the school mistress received £50 per annum, as opposed to the schoolmaster's £200 per annum. The only other girls' school in Greenwich was Boreham's Bluecoat School in Limekiln Lane, which is now Greenwich South Street, and that catered for just 24 girls. And here you can see the inscription on St Alfred's Church Hall. It's still there today, the National School for excellence and industry for girls. Soon, the boys' school was catering for 200 boys. The demand for education was growing, and the trustees opened 2 branch schools at the junction of Old Woolwich Road and East Street. By 1853, the 4 Roan charity schools were educating 630 boys and girls. Then came a major change for the schools, with the introduction in 1870 of the Elementary Education Act. It aimed to put education within the reach of all children. The School Board for London, which was established by the Act, began to lay its plans for new buildings, and the Endowed Schools Commissioners drew up a scheme of school closure and the transfer of the boys and girls to the Board's 2 new schools built in 1877. One for 300 boys on East Street, and if you can see running through the centre of the Booth poverty map that's on the screen now, you've got Woolwich Road, which becomes Hog Lane, and just above that you can see the word school, and that was where the school was established. Eastney Street runs just along its other side. The other school was the girls' school in Devonshire Drive, and at this point the name of the schools was changed from Greycoat to Roan Schools. The Roan estate was not sufficient to support these new large schools, so they received additional funding from the London School Board, and this was the start of a joint funding initiative between a school board and a charitable foundation. The reorganisation was designed to give a superior education of the character usually given to the best middle class schools. It introduced a headmaster for the boys and a headmistress for the girls' school, who were allowed to appoint assistant teachers and to establish a curriculum. The larger girls' school on Devonshire Drive was designed, here it is, designed by a local architect and resident, Thomas Dinwiddie. He also designed the Jubilee Almshouses on Greenwich High Road, if you know them. The school was constructed in red brick in a Gothic style. It was one of the first purpose-built secondary schools and provided separate classrooms for all subjects. These were closely connected by a large galleried hall, providing for the 300 pupils. William Gladstone, who had been Prime Minister and would be again, was at the time the MP for Greenwich. He was invited to open the school. He had to decline, but the opening on the 2nd of May 1878 was attended by 3 leading lights of the women's suffrage movement: Emily Davies, the founder of Girton College, Cambridge, Helen Taylor, and the artist Alice Westlake. They all made speeches. The Astronomer Royal, Sir George Airy, also attended the meeting. I've recently come across the speeches that were made by the 3 suffragettes, and I'd like to quote from some of them. Emily Davies spoke about the important role that would need to be played by parents. There was a fear at the time that girls would be overworked by attending school. This is what Emily Davies had to say. Parents say there is a great danger of overworking girls at public schools, but it is not altogether overwork. It is the unfortunate conditions at home under which their work is done. If parents so arrange that their children had not to do their lessons in the midst of great noise and talk, which tends to increase fatigue, overwork would be almost unknown. She went on to say that parents should talk to their children about school, ask what they have been doing, not for the sake of gossip, but by evincing an interest in their school affairs, create in the minds of children a greater interest in the school and its work. She went on to talk about the mix in the school, the mix of classes. Parents say of public schools that they don't much like the mixture. Now, this is a mistake. It is a mistake to suppose that children's manners are not refined when classes are so mixed together. Manners do not depend on social position and wealth, neither are they limited to any class whatever. If children are brought up well at home, they will show good manners at school. Helen Taylor addressed the issue of the general neglect of education for girls. Girls are untaught because they are such great use at home. Alan Westlake emphasised the need for girls to be taught the sciences. The school became one of the leading grammar schools addressing the needs of girls' education, and a new wing was added in 1936. You can see the new wing on your screen now. It was on the site of a cottage that was previously used by the school caretaker and secretary. The new wing provided a flat for the caretaker at the top, an assembly hall with a large gallery and stage, domestic science rooms and science labs. As demand for education and accommodation grew, a new boys' school was built on Maze Hill, and it was opened in 1928. You'll be familiar with this building. It was opened by Herbert Fisher, a former Minister for Education. The architects were Bannister Fletcher, who was later knighted and became President of the Royal Society of British Architects, and Percy Boothroyd Dunnett, a former Roan School pupil. The architectural styling was inspired by the style of buildings such as Magdalen College in Greenwich and the Old Greenwich Hospital. A feature was made that the windows could be opened fully to turn the classroom into a near open air environment, something that would be much appreciated now with the COVID restrictions. So what happened to the schools and the pupils when war broke out? At the start of World War II, the girls were evacuated to battle in Sussex. The girls were assembled in the school playground with gas masks, food and suitcases, together with their families who had come to say goodbye. They were not told where they were going until they were on the train. In 1940, the evacuees were moved to schools in South Wales. The boys' school was evacuated here too, and by the end of the evacuation process, the youngest boys and girls were being taught together. During these war years, the Devonshire Drive building, the girls' school, served as an emergency school for the children of families who were unwilling to evacuate. In 1941, plans to establish a public cleansing centre at the girls' school were announced. This would have provided cleaning for individuals who'd been contaminated by chemical warfare attacks, both civilian and military. As you can imagine, the school trustees were not impressed and their objections won out. There was some bomb damage to the Devonshire Drive School and a large bomb crater in the playground. Moving forward to 1977, an agreement was made by the Inner London Education Authority and the Roan Foundation for the amalgamation of the two Roan schools and Charlton School for Boys. And this was to establish a new mixed comprehensive school, the John Roan School. Plans were completed in 1980 and the new buildings were added to in Westcombe Park in 1981. Today, the Roan Foundation owns properties in Greenwich, mainly in Roan Street, as well as the Maze Hill School building, the playing fields in Kidbrook Park Road, and an outdoor centre, Braithwaite, in the Lake District. Income from the Foundation's assets allows it to further students' education by helping the school to fund projects which fall outside the state provision. For example, it funds the school orchestra, allowing every student to learn an instrument. It provides and maintains minibuses, individual bursaries to students in need, and computers throughout the school. The Foundation has frequently provided the school with over £100,000 a year. So we'll come to me. I was a pupil at the school from 1960 to 1967. Here I am in my school uniform, aged 11, a green gym slip, which had to be 2 inches below the knee. This was the 60s, so as the decade wore on, the skirts got shorter, of course. The gym slip was green, Roan green, the shirt was gold, and the tie was blue, light blue and green, and my velour hat was green. Now, if you were caught outside school in your uniform without your hat on, that was a great offence, and you had to stand in assembly while everybody else was sitting on the floor in the hall with your hat on, and wear it for the rest of the day in school. So it was something you tried to stay out of the way of the prefects who might catch you without your hat if you were in the street. The school was 2-form entry, catering for 360 girls, and the intake included girls like me who came from the local housing estates in South East London, in keeping with John Roan's wishes. The school celebrated Founders' Day every year with a service in St Alfred's Church. It was the only time we got together with the boys' school. Each week at school we had a lesson in what was called speech training. The aim was to get us to speak clearly and put the emphasis on pronunciation, but it meant that my colourful South East London accent was successfully drilled out of me. The lessons were taken by our English teacher, a Miss Wilson, who announced to us in 1963 that she was retiring. She was retiring and getting married. We were very shocked. We unkindly thought she was far too old to marry. She was leaving to marry the author John Wyndham, who wrote Day of the Triffids and other best-selling novels. When doing the research for this talk, I began to wonder why they married so late. They were both around 59, 60 years old. I discovered that they had known each other for several decades. The University of Liverpool has in its archives the hundreds of love letters that he wrote to her. The archive states, the pair had an unusual relationship. Grace was a school teacher and would have been forced to leave her job had she married Wyndham. So their love remained clandestine until her retirement in 1963. Grace Wilson lived in Plumstead, but they had met at the Pen Club in Bloomsbury, and they obtained adjacent rooms there. John Wyndham died in 1969, aged 65, so they just had 6 years of married life together. In his book, The Trouble with Litchen, Wyndham explores the issues facing women forced by their biology to choose between careers and love. I now see Grace Wilson in a different light, of course. I have to assume that she enjoyed her career, but I do admire her commitment to girls' education. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara. That's fascinating. I really love the link to the suffragettes. I think that's such an exciting thing for the school. And hearing you say that Emily Davis was talking even back then about the important role of parents and the need for them to talk to their children about the day and to make sure they had a nice quiet place to work, I think was particularly good. And that lovely story of love of the head teacher who had the love of her job as well as the love of John Wyndham. So there's some lovely connections that you brought to us. I'm going to encourage people to ask questions, and one question that has popped up straight away, I don't know whether you can answer this really, but I think your story about hats really struck a note with someone, because they said, when were hats dropped from the school uniform? I'm thinking, gosh, that would be an interesting addition for us, wouldn't it? And how many people would be in detention for wearing hats? But do you know when the hats were actually dropped from the school uniform?
I don't know when they were dropped. I've got a feeling it might have been the 80s, but they were certainly around in the 70s, maybe during the 80s. There were options for hats. There was the velour that I was wearing. You could have a beret, a skull cap. Those were all winter hats. In the summer, you had to wear a Panama.
A Panama. And what about the boys? What were the boys wearing?
They wore the traditional boys' caps. But when we were on Founders' Day at St Alphege, the girls had to wear their hats in church. The boys were not allowed to wear their hats in church. The only time they could take them off when they were outside the school in uniform. Very interesting how the rules for boys and girls are were so incredibly different. I was also really rather interested that a headmistress got paid 4 times less than a headmaster. And there's still questions, aren't there, about whether women and men are paid equally. So, you know, it's been going on for some years. Another question that's come through is about speech training. And the question here is, did the boys also have speech training lessons? That's a good point. I imagine, to be honest, I don't know. I was about to say I imagine that they did, but when you think of the disadvantage that girls had at that time, I think that the reasoning behind the elocution lessons was to ensure that we got on in life. I think if I, you know, I had a broad Southeast London accent, and I think, although thankfully that would never happen now, it would never be drilled out of you, quite rightly, but I do think it helped me to get on in later life. I think your voice is so important, and I think at that time it helped me to move through higher education and into the career that I had. So maybe it wasn't considered so important for boys. It would be interesting to find out if they had elocution lessons too. I'll keep an eye on the questions. We've got a few answers on some hats. So we've got someone here who said that when they joined the boys' school in 1964, caps were compulsory then. Yeah. And there's someone else who's saying that when she was at school in 1970, they all wore berets. So maybe the choice of hats was dropped at some point. And there's something there about a house button. Did you have a house button on your hat? Not on my hat. It was on my gym slip. You may have noticed a very small badge on the top of my gym slip, and that was my house badge. So there were 4 houses, and they were local historic houses. There was Queen's, Chesterfield, Dartmouth, and Bamborough. So 4 local historic houses, and we were each in one of those.
Okay, so we've got some comments here sort of about it being a wonderful presentation, and do you still have friendships from the school? Because I mean, obviously you're still local, so I'm assuming that you still have those contacts. Yeah.
I do.
And there's someone here who's saying she went to the John Roan and she was the first year in the Westcombe Park site as a mixed environment. So you know, we've got people who've got such great histories with the school. I'm just struggling to read all of these things as they're coming through. So someone here who was at Roan between 70 and 77, so 10 years behind you.
Yes.
Did you, as a girl, get to use the school field for your sports?
We did. We used the fields for tennis, for hockey, netball. We played in the school playground. Just behind the building on Devonshire Drive, but we did use the playing fields and we were taken by coach.
And I'm just thinking, and there's a question here that makes me think this, that the foundation, obviously you mentioned that the foundation own the playing fields, but they are also very, very enthusiastic at promoting music in the school. And we're just wondering whether when you were at school, whether music was something you were encouraged in at all.
We had a music lesson once a week. It was theory. It was very dry. It wasn't something I enjoyed. I think it wasn't presented well. I didn't have the opportunity to learn an instrument, so I don't think it was particularly encouraged at when I was at school. It was it was on the curriculum.
Okay, so something that probably wasn't on the curriculum but makes me think of the Harry Potter books in particular, I think, is where this question's going, is did Nellie Noakes float around the corridors when you were there? I'm thinking Nellie Noakes might well be a ghost.
Yes, I don't believe in ghosts.
So maybe she didn't float in front of you.
I would not have recognised Nellie Noakes.
There's someone here who was at the school between 61 and 68, so overlapping with you,
yes,
who had elocution lessons with Miss Wilson. It was an extra and needed to be paid for. Well,
that wasn't the case for me or my contemporaries, as far as I know. Certainly my parents didn't pay for the speech training lessons. It was part of the curriculum, and everybody, she came into the classroom and we all had the lesson. So maybe there were additional lessons that you could have outside outside the once a week. Maybe you could have extra.
It does sound as if that's possible, and we've got confirmation here that the boys did have some speech training as part of their English curriculum.
Yes.
And Chris Strong is the person who's accepted responsibility for the CAP comment, so he was adding in on that. Chris is one of our foundation trustees, and we've got something here about where did you find the text of the speeches given by the women at the opening of the girls' school?
They were sent to me by a historian who is researching suffragettes and the women's suffrage movement, and she came across the speeches quite recently and sent them to me. I can send them to Kath if you'd like them, and then you could send them on to anyone who'd like to see them. They were printed in the Kentish Mercury.
Right, well, I'm sure there will be people who are interested in that. And one of the things that someone's asked is they're having to go, and this has been recorded, and so it will be available for people who want to watch it all again. So John Wyndham was actually, interestingly, a very big part of the English literature course at the boys' school in the 70s. I wonder why that was. But yeah, I mean, I would hope he was part of the course in many schools. And you mentioned the names of the girls' houses, and the boys' houses were Drake, Rodney, Nelson and Wolfe. we've got from someone here.
Yeah.
And someone was asking here, did your music teacher, obviously you haven't got great memories of your music lessons, was it Miss Lister who was your teacher?
It was.
Yes. I think people are back on memory lane here, you know.
He was very
so you were there in the 60s, and so we've got one of the listeners here who is saying, did the 60s swing at the John Roan Girls' School, or was the atmosphere quite sedate?
I would say the 60s were swinging at the girls' school. Certainly for me, I don't think you could avoid what was happening around you. And when we had our sixth form dance, we had Slade for the sixth form dance, which I mean was wonderful that they came and played in the school hall. I believe, but one of the old boys would have to confirm this, that Eric Clapton played at the boys' school, but I'd need confirmation on that. That's what I was told. But certainly we had great fun going out and seeing all the bands in Southeast London.
Brilliant. And your gym slips got shorter, so definitely swinging around. There's a few little things here. Nellie Noakes is apparently on the school register.
Oh, right.
And there's a comment here, wasn't she, Nellie Noakes, in the top floor rooms? And did you have to embroider your initials on your gym skirt when you made it?
Yes, we did have to embroider our initials. Sewing was something I wasn't very good at either, and I think I took mine out of school against the rules so that my mum could actually do the embroidery for me, because I couldn't get on with it at all. Sneaked it back in.
Now, there's someone here who was at the Roan Girls' School between 60 and 65, Julie Andrews, née Brooks. And she had oboe lessons after school paid for by her parents. But she says she remembers Miss Wilson, but she doesn't recognise you.
Oh, gosh, Julie. I mean, if we were there at the same time, we must have. I think I remember who you are. Yes. Yeah.
That sounds like a good invitation to get back in touch, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So someone else is saying here that now they think of it, the paid for elocution lessons were an extra in the lunch break. And now I remember the speech training lesson for the whole class.
Yes.
I was sent these lessons as I had a very quiet voice, and I think my mother wanted me to learn to speak up. So yeah, all right. So maybe that was that one.
Extracurricular.
Yes. And there's someone here, Sue, saying, we did have another famous person attached to the school. When I was there in 70 to 75, our English teacher, Mr. Cross, was married to the actress Hildegard Neal, and they produced our school plays until she left him for Brian Blessed.
Oh.
We've got the connections at the John Roan. We absolutely have, haven't we? Oh, this is an interesting one. So the school rules for the girls' school in 1895, so a little bit before your time, Barbara, included rule number 3, no romping games in the schoolhouse. The mind boggles. Has anyone any idea what this referred to? So there's a comment here saying that music was encouraged a lot at the boys' school in the late 60s and early 70s, and there was a thriving band. So maybe that's why Clapton came along to join in. And Chris is saying that he doesn't remember Eric Clapton, but the boys had Brett Marvin and the Thunderbolts playing in 1971.
Oh, right. Yes.
So there's a lot of people moving back in memory lane here.
Yeah.
So Ralph Lawson is saying, you mentioned that John Roan's only child died in infancy. However, are you aware of any descendants of the Roan family who are alive today?
No, no, I'm not. That would be an interesting thing to follow up.
It would, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
And there is someone here, Alison Chumley, saying, wouldn't it be good to have a girls' reunion meeting up? So maybe we can, through this, organise a little bit of a get together of the girls.
Yes, that would be good.
Yeah, and Nellie Noakes is appearing again. I tell you, I need to meet this. So, rather a silly question, says Bella, but I was at the Devonshire Drive in the last year of it being a girls' school. We did not wear hats. So the hats obviously
did go in the 80s. Yeah.
Went just after you, really. It was the year before Westcombe Park opened. And did you have the horror tale of Nellie Noakes? I'm fairly certain that when the girls get together on their reunion, Nellie Noakes is going to be absolutely there in the middle of it all. So Barbara, we've had lots of lovely questions and people have really very much enjoyed, I think, going back and beginning to think about their school days. And I think you've done very well there. It feels to me that this is the beginning of something. It feels to me that out of this, I'm going to get bombarded by emails wanting me to connect people, which is great. I feel really excited about sort of really getting to understand the history of the school. And, you know, there's not many schools in the country that go back as far as we do. And I think those little memories that you've brought us, in particular, obviously what sparked people's ideas is Nellie Noakes, it's wearing caps, it's gym slips and everything else, but it's just lovely. And I've got this wonderful image of green and gold girls walking to school with their hats on and everything. It's just really lovely. So thank you so much for your time. It's been a lovely little foray into the past. I'll just check to see whether I've got any more questions or comments. Aha, the Manfred Mann Band with Paul Jones played at the boys' school in 1964.
Yes, because he lived in Blackheath. Manfred Mann lived in Blackheath. So yes, they would have been very local. I missed that one.
Well, you were quite young then, weren't you? It was only halfway through. It's probably by 66, 67 that you would have been absolutely swinging with the 60s.
I think it was 63 when, you know, because it was Beatles and Stones. And so I was about 13, I think, when I was going to the nighttime gigs and things.
Okay, still not able to embroider your name on your gym slip. So I'm going to finish on a final comment about Nellie. All right, so Barbara, I'm going to thank you for everything. And the information we've got here is that as far as Linda knows, Nellie got knocked down outside the school and then came back to haunt it, and she was often seen in the changing rooms.
Yes, I've heard that story. Yes.
Yeah. So bit of a tragic end, but she's clearly wasn't that keen on leaving. Yep. Yeah. So Barbara, thank you so much for a really interesting evening. I know lots of people have really enjoyed hearing your stories, and we have recorded this so they can watch it all again. And do keep in touch. And it does sound as if there's a number of girls that would quite like to make connections and get together. So on behalf of everyone here, and I wish that there was a way in which we could interact better, but in a few months' time, maybe we'll be able to have a live meeting as well. But thank you so much for your time, and good night, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.